Stray cat brings kittens to woman's house. Their story is incredibly touching. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The wind swept softly through the small garden, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the smell of freshly turned earth. Beyond the fence, the hum of a distant street mingled with the calls of birds. But inside the weathered little house at the edge of town, all was still. Mary sat by the window, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands, her gaze fixed on the world outside. It was a quiet view, just her overgrown backyard, bordered by a weathered wooden fence. She had lived here for as long as she could remember, the house holding memories like old, faded photographs. Her children had grown up and moved away, starting families of their own in distant cities, leaving Mary alone in the stillness. She didn't mind it most days. Quiet was something she had grown used to, but today something was different. As her eyes traced the backyard, a flicker of movement caught her attention, a flash of orange darting between the bushes. Mary squinted, leaning closer to the window. For a moment, she thought it might be a fox, but no, the movement was softer, less wild. Then, from the shadows of the garden, it emerged. A cat. Its coat was a warm shade of ginger, stripes running along its back like soft brushstrokes of paint. It moved cautiously, pausing now and then to look around, its green eyes sharp and alert. Its fur was slightly dirty, matted in places, as though it had spent far too much time in the world alone. It was thin, though not desperately so, and there was a wary grace in its movements that told Mary this was no pampered house cat. This one was wild, or at least it had been for a long while. "Well, look at you," Mary murmured to herself, setting her tea down on the small side table. She stood slowly, her knees creaking in protest, and moved toward the door. When she stepped outside, the cat froze, its eyes locking onto hers. Mary lifted her hands, palms up, her voice soft as a whisper. "Don't worry, I'm not here to hurt you." The cat didn't move. It watched her with that unblinking stare, ears twitching faintly as though trying to decide if she was friend or foe. Mary took another cautious step forward, then stopped. "You're just passing through, I'm sure," she said, half to herself. "Nothing to see here, really." The cat tilted its head slightly, as though considering her words. Then, with a soft flick of its tail, it turned and disappeared back into the bushes, leaving Mary standing alone on the porch. She smiled faintly, shaking her head as she turned back inside. "A stray," she muttered under her breath. Nothing unusual about that. Over the next few days, the ginger cat returned, always lingering at the edge of the yard where the garden grew wild and tangled. Mary noticed it more often now, its sharp green eyes watching her through the window or across the lawn. At first, it kept its distance, vanishing the moment she stepped outside. But slowly, cautiously, the cat began to trust her, or at least tolerate her presence. One morning, Mary decided to leave a small plate of food near the edge of the porch. Nothing fancy, just a little leftover chicken from the night before. She placed it gently on the ground, then stepped back, watching from the window as the cat crept closer. The ginger cat moved carefully, every step deliberate and cautious. It paused once, looking toward the house as though checking to see if it was a trick, before sniffing at the plate. Then, satisfied, it began to eat, its movements quick and efficient, as though it had learned not to linger over a meal for too long. From her spot at the window, Mary watched with a faint smile. "You'll be back tomorrow," she said quietly. "I just know it." She was right. The next morning, the cat was there again, sitting near the porch like a tiny statue, its green eyes fixed on the door. Mary chuckled as she placed another plate of food outside. "You're smarter than you look," she called softly, watching as the cat darted forward to eat. By the end of the week, the routine had become a quiet ritual. Each morning, Mary left food outside, and each morning, the ginger cat appeared to eat it. Slowly, it began to linger a little longer, curling up near the edge of the porch to clean itself after its meal. It still kept its distance, wary of sudden movements or loud noises, but it no longer fled at the sight of Mary stepping outside. One afternoon, as Mary sat in her old wicker chair on the porch, the cat approached her for the first time. It was slow at first, its movements hesitant, but eventually, it crept close enough to sit just a few feet away from her chair. Mary sat perfectly still, not wanting to startle it. "Brave today, aren't we?" she said softly, her voice warm and calm. The cat didn't respond, of course, but it stayed there, watching her. Its tail flicked occasionally, brushing against the wooden floorboards of the porch. For the first time, Mary noticed something she hadn't seen before. The faint curve of the cat's belly, slightly rounded beneath its fur. She frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Are you?" She stopped herself, not wanting to say it out loud. But the more she looked, the more certain she became. The cat wasn't just a stray, it was a stray with kittens. "Well, that explains a lot," Mary said softly, shaking her head. "You're not just looking for food for yourself, are you?" The cat tilted its head slightly, as though it understood her words. Then, with a final glance, it stood and padded back into the garden, disappearing into the overgrown grass. That night, Mary sat at her kitchen table, staring out the window into the darkness beyond. Her mind kept drifting back to the cat, the thinness of its body, the slight roundness of its belly, the way it had watched her with those sharp green eyes. There was something about it that tugged at her heart, a quiet plea she couldn't quite explain. She thought about the kittens, wherever they might be. Were they hidden somewhere in the forest that bordered her backyard? Were they warm, or hungry, or scared? She imagined the ginger cat returning to them after each meal, curling its body around them to keep them safe, and her heart ached. "Poor thing," she murmured softly, wrapping her hands around her teacup. The next morning, Mary woke earlier than usual, the soft light of dawn spilling through the curtains. She made herself a cup of tea, her movements slower than they used to be, and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cool and still, the world not yet awake. And there, sitting at the edge of the porch, was the cat. But this time it wasn't alone. Mary froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the scene before her. The ginger cat sat tall and proud, its green eyes fixed on her as though waiting for her to notice. Nestled in the grass beside it were 4 small kittens, tiny, gray, and impossibly fluffy. They sat in a neat row, their wide eyes blinking up at her curiously. "Oh my," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. The cat gave a quiet meow, as if to say, "Here they are. Look after them." For a long moment, Mary could do nothing but stare, her heart swelling with a mix of surprise, wonder, and something deeper, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The kittens were so small, their little ears perked up, their tails curled neatly around their tiny paws. They looked at her with an innocence that made her chest ache. Slowly, Mary stepped closer, her movements careful and deliberate. "You brought them to me," she murmured, her voice soft with disbelief. "You really brought them here." The cat didn't move. It simply watched her, its gaze steady and unblinking. The kittens, too, stayed perfectly still, as though sensing the importance of the moment. Mary crouched down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and held out a hand. One of the kittens tilted its head, its tiny nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Then, to Mary's amazement, it took a small step forward, brushing its soft fur against her outstretched fingers. Tears stung Mary's eyes as she looked up at the ginger cat, who sat watching her with an expression she couldn't quite describe. Gratitude, perhaps. Trust. "You knew," Mary whispered, her voice breaking. "You knew I'd take care of them." The cat gave another soft meow, as though confirming her words. And in that moment, Mary understood. Mary stayed crouched in the dewy grass for what felt like an eternity, her gaze shifting between the ginger cat and the small bundle of gray kittens gathered at her feet. The kittens were impossibly tiny, smaller than her cupped hands, and their fur was soft as wisps of clouds. Their little eyes, still slightly unfocused, blinked up at her with curious innocence, as though trying to decide whether she was friend or foe. One kitten took a cautious step forward, its tiny paws pressing into the grass, its tail flicking behind it for balance. Mary smiled faintly, her heart swelling at the sight. "Brave little thing, aren't you?" she murmured, reaching out a hand. The kitten sniffed her fingers delicately before letting out the softest of mews, a sound so small that it might have been carried away by the morning breeze. The ginger cat watched the interaction carefully, its green eyes sharp and unreadable. It sat like a sentinel, its tail curled neatly around its paws, as though waiting for something. Perhaps permission to leave, or reassurance that Mary understood her role now. Mary looked up at the cat, tears gathering in her eyes as she whispered, "You brought them to me." Her voice trembled slightly, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. "You trusted me enough to bring them here." The cat didn't move, but there was something in the way it held her gaze. A quiet acknowledgement, a bond that needed no words. Mary turned her attention back to the kittens, who were now beginning to explore the porch, their tiny noses pressed to the wood as they stumbled clumsily over each other. She laughed softly, a sound that felt foreign after so many quiet years. "You're going to need names, aren't you?" she said, her voice lighter now, as though the weight on her shoulders had suddenly lifted. She pointed to the brave little kitten that had approached her first. "You'll be Scout," she decided, "because you're not afraid to take the first step." Scout mewed again, almost as though it approved of the name, before tumbling over its own feet in an effort to chase a small leaf skittering across the porch. Mary's laughter bubbled up again, warm and genuine. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. That afternoon, Mary set to work making the kittens comfortable. She rummaged through the hall closet, pulling out an old cardboard box and a worn quilt that had once belonged to her youngest son. The fabric was soft and faded, but it would do. She arranged the quilt inside the box, tucking it carefully to make sure there were no sharp edges or folds that might scratch the kittens. When she brought the box outside and placed it on the porch, the kittens immediately climbed in, their tiny bodies sinking into the warm folds of fabric. Scout was the first to settle down, curling up into a little gray ball in one corner. The others followed quickly, their tiny tails flicking as they nestled together in a bundle of soft fur. The ginger cat watched from a distance, perched on the edge of the garden like a silent guardian. It had been watching Mary all morning, carefully observing her movements as though ensuring that she followed through on her unspoken promise. "I'll take care of them," Mary said softly, looking toward the cat. "You don't have to worry." The cat didn't respond, of course, but its ears twitched slightly, as though it had heard her words. After a long moment, it stood and began to walk toward the porch, its movements slow and deliberate. Mary held her breath as the cat approached the box, her heart pounding faintly in her chest. Would it approve of the little nest she had made? Would it trust her enough to stay? The cat paused beside the box, sniffing the edge of the quilt before turning its gaze to Mary. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two souls bound together by something neither of them could explain. Then, to Mary's surprise, the cat stepped into the box and curled its body protectively around the kittens. Mary's shoulders sagged with relief as she let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Good," she whispered, smiling faintly. "That's good." The days that followed were some of the happiest Mary had known in years. The routine that had once felt monotonous. Tea in the morning, weeding the garden, staring at the empty house, was suddenly filled with purpose. Each morning, she brought fresh food and water to the porch, watching as the ginger cat ate first before letting the kittens share. Scout always led the way, of course, tumbling over its siblings in its eagerness to get to the food. Mary spent hours sitting on the porch watching the kittens play. They wrestled clumsily with each other, tumbling across the wooden boards in a blur of soft gray fur and twitching tails. Sometimes, the ginger cat joined them, swatting gently at the kittens with one paw or curling its tail around them as though gathering them all close. Mary couldn't help but laugh as she watched Scout attempt to pounce on a moth, only to miss and roll ungracefully onto its back. "You're a wild one, aren't you?" she said fondly, reaching out to scratch Scout's ears. The kitten purred loudly in response, leaning into her hand with a contented sigh. The other kittens began to grow bolder, too. One of them, a slightly darker gray with faint stripes on its back, was particularly curious about Mary's shoes, batting at the laces with a determination that made her chuckle. I'll call you Whiskers, she decided, laughing softly as the kitten pounced on her foot. The smallest of the kittens, a delicate gray with wide amber eyes, spent most of its time curled up in Mary's lap, purring softly as she stroked its fur. "You're the quiet one, aren't you?" she murmured, her voice gentle. "I think I'll call you Misty." And the last kitten, the fluffiest of the bunch with tufts of fur that stuck out in all directions, was always the one who got into trouble. It climbed onto the porch railing, tried to chase butterflies that were far out of reach, and wrestled its siblings with gleeful abandon. "You're trouble, that's for sure," Mary said with a grin. "I'll call you Rascal." The name suited them, Mary thought, and as the days passed, the kittens began to respond to her voice. Even the ginger cat seemed to accept Mary now, watching her with calm green eyes that no longer held the wariness they'd once had. One morning, as Mary sat in her chair with a cup of tea in hand, the ginger cat climbed onto her lap for the first time. The movement startled her at first. The cat had never been that close before, but when she looked down, she saw the trust in its eyes. "Well, aren't you full of surprises?" she said softly, reaching out to stroke its fur. The cat purred in response, its body relaxing against hers as though it had finally decided she was worthy of its trust. Mary smiled, tears pricking at her eyes as she ran her fingers through the cat's soft coat. "You're not just a stray, are you?" she whispered, her voice catching. "You're something special. And you knew I needed this, didn't you?" The cat didn't answer, of course, but it didn't need to. The warmth of its body, the steady rhythm of its purring, it was enough. As Mary sat there on the porch, surrounded by the kittens playing at her feet and the ginger cat curled in her lap, she realized something. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty anymore. The quiet that had once felt suffocating was now filled with the sounds of life. Tiny mews, soft purrs, and the occasional crash as Rascal knocked over a flower pot in his excitement. Mary laughed at the sound, shaking her head. "You're lucky you're cute," she called, watching as Rascal darted back toward the box with his tail held high. The ginger cat lifted its head slightly, its green eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, Mary thought she saw something there. Something deep and knowing, as though the cat understood far more than it let on. "Thank you," Mary whispered softly, her voice barely audible. "For bringing them to me." The cat purred again, closing its eyes as it settled more comfortably into her lap. Mary leaned back in her chair, letting the sunlight warm her face as she watched the kittens tumble across the porch. For the first time in as long as she could remember, her heart felt full. The days turned into weeks, and life on Mary's little porch bloomed with new energy. The kittens grew stronger and bolder with every passing day, their playful antics filling the once quiet house with laughter and noise. Rascal continued to be the troublemaker, constantly climbing places he shouldn't, knocking over flower pots, and attempting daring leaps off the porch railing, each time leaving Mary half scolding, half laughing as she scooped him back up. Whiskers had developed a love for exploring shoes. No pair was safe from the curious little gray kitten. He'd bat at laces, crawl inside boots, and once, to Mary's great amusement, managed to fall asleep with his tiny head poking out of her garden clogs. Misty, the quietest of the group, seemed content to spend her time curled in Mary's lap. Whenever the others grew too wild, Misty would retreat to Mary's chair, where she would press her small body against Mary's hand, purring like a tiny engine as Mary stroked her fur. Scout remained the leader, the little adventurer who always took the first step. Whether it was jumping off the porch for the first time or chasing after a butterfly that had drifted too close. Wherever Scout went, the others would eventually follow. A small parade of fluff stumbling through the grass behind their brave sibling. And through it all, the ginger cat watched. Mary had started calling the mother cat Autumn, a name inspired by her warm, fiery coat and the way she had appeared in Mary's life just as the leaves had started to fall. Autumn's wariness had melted away now, replaced with a quiet trust that Mary cherished deeply. The cat no longer hovered at the edges of the yard, hidden in shadows. Instead, she had taken up a spot on the porch, sometimes sunning herself on the railing, other times curling up near Mary's feet as the kittens played. "She knows," Mary often whispered to herself when Autumn nudged her hand or purred softly. "She knows I'll take care of them," and Mary did. Every morning, she prepared food and fresh water, carefully arranging it on the porch for the growing kittens and their mother. She swept the porch clean of leaves and dirt, creating a safe space where the kittens could play and sleep. In the evenings, she sat with them, sipping tea as she watched the sun dip below the horizon. The sky streaked with hues of orange and pink. The loneliness she had carried for so many years, so heavy and suffocating, felt lighter now, replaced with a warmth she hadn't known she'd been missing. One crisp afternoon, Mary decided it was time to take the kittens to the vet. They were growing fast, and she wanted to make sure they were healthy. She'd managed to find a local vet clinic that agreed to help her at a reduced price, understanding that the kittens were rescues. "Come on, little ones," she said brightly as she carefully placed the kittens into a large, padded basket. Rascal squirmed immediately, letting out an indignant meow that made Mary laugh. "You're not going on an adventure, Rascal. Just a little checkup." Scout was already trying to climb the edge of the basket, his sharp little claws hooking into the fabric. Whiskers and Misty huddled close together, their wide amber eyes peeking up at Mary with curiosity and just a hint of nervousness. Autumn sat a few feet away, watching intently as Mary scooped up the last kitten. Her tail flicked restlessly, but she didn't interfere, as though she understood what Mary was doing. "I'll take good care of them," Mary promised, crouching down to look Autumn in the eye. "I'll bring them back. Don't you worry." The ginger cat didn't move, but her gaze softened just slightly, and for a moment, Mary could have sworn there was understanding there. The vet visit was smoother than Mary had expected. The kittens were curious but well-behaved, earning smiles and compliments from the staff. "They're healthy," the vet assured her, adjusting his glasses as he scribbled notes onto a clipboard. "A little underweight, but nothing some good meals and care won't fix. You've done a wonderful job with them." Mary's heart swelled with pride as she looked at the kittens, who were now happily exploring the exam room. "They're a blessing," she replied softly. "All of them." As she drove back home, the basket nestled on the passenger seat beside her. Mary couldn't stop smiling. The kittens were chirping and mewing softly, the sound filling the car like music. "Almost home, little ones," she said, glancing toward them as she turned onto her street. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw Autumn waiting on the porch. The ginger cat was sitting tall, her green eyes fixed on the car, as though she had known Mary was coming. The moment Mary stepped out, basket in hand, Autumn stood and padded over to meet her. "See," Mary said as she crouched down and opened the basket. "They're fine. I told you I'd bring them back." One by one, the kittens tumbled out of the basket and onto the porch, greeted immediately by their mother. Autumn sniffed each of them in turn, nudging them gently with her nose as though counting to make sure they were all there. Then, satisfied, she curled up in her usual spot near the corner of the porch, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws. "You're a good mama, you know that?" Mary said, smiling as she watched the kittens climb over Autumn, mewing excitedly as they tried to nurse. Autumn blinked slowly, her gaze softening as she looked toward Mary. That night, as Mary sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she thought about how much had changed since the day Autumn had first appeared. The house, once so quiet, was now alive with the sound of tiny paws scampering across the floor, the soft thud of kittens leaping off furniture, and the constant hum of purring that filled the air like a lullaby. Mary no longer felt the weight of loneliness pressing on her chest. The emptiness that had once haunted her was gone, replaced by the warmth of her unexpected family. She looked down at the porch, where the kittens were curled up together in a sleepy pile, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. Scout was sprawled across the top of the heap, his paws twitching as he dreamed. Whiskers was nestled close to Misty, their fur blending together in a soft blur of gray. Rascal, true to his name, had managed to wriggle away from the group and was now curled up in the corner of Mary's chair, his head resting against her leg. Autumn sat nearby, her eyes half closed as she watched over her kittens. Every so often, she would glance toward Mary, as though checking to make sure she was still there. You knew, didn't you? Mary whispered, her voice soft. You knew I needed them as much as they needed me. The ginger cat didn't respond, but her tail flicked gently, and Mary took that as an answer. She reached down to stroke Rascal's fur, the little kitten letting out a sleepy purr in response. Thank you, Mary said, looking at Autumn with tears gathering in her eyes. For trusting me, for bringing them here. Autumn blinked slowly, a movement so deliberate that it almost felt like a nod. As the days grew colder and the leaves began to fall, Mary's porch became a sanctuary for the little family she had grown to love. She placed a soft bed in the corner, lined with blankets to keep the kittens warm, and set up a small shelter just off the porch for Autumn, though the cat spent most of her time curled up near Mary's chair. Neighbors who passed by often stopped to admire the kittens, their faces lighting up with smiles as they watched the tiny balls of fur chase leaves or wrestle with each other in the grass. You've got quite the family here, Mary, one of them said one afternoon, leaning over the fence to watch Rascal tumble headfirst into a flower pot. I do, Mary replied with a smile, her heart full. They're my little miracles. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Mary sat back in her chair, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. Autumn lay at her feet, her green eyes half closed as she dozed in the fading light. The kittens were curled up in a sleepy pile nearby, their soft purrs mingling with the quiet hum of the evening. For the first time in years, Mary felt like her life was exactly as it was meant to be, simple, warm, and filled with love. Good night, little ones, she whispered, smiling softly as she closed her eyes and let the peace of the moment wash over her. The first frost of winter came early that year. Mary woke to find a thin layer of frost clinging to the edges of her window panes, glimmering faintly in the weak morning light. Outside, the garden was dusted with a delicate white sheen, and her breath fogged the air as she stepped onto the porch with a blanket draped over her shoulders. The kittens were huddled together in their soft bed, nestled in a tangle of fur and tiny paws. Scout, as always, was the first to stir, stretching his little body and letting out a dramatic yawn before blinking sleepily at Mary. Good morning, Trouble, she said with a smile, reaching down to scratch his ears. The others soon followed, waking with soft mews and wobbly stretches, their fur sticking up in tufts from the chill. Autumn appeared a moment later, emerging from the small shelter Mary had set up just off the porch. Her fur was dusted with frost, and she shook herself once, scattering the delicate crystals into the air. Mary clucked her tongue in disapproval, stepping back inside to fetch the bowls of food and warm water she'd prepared. You'll freeze out there, she scolded gently as she placed the bowls down, watching as Autumn padded over to eat. I don't know how you did it before you found me. Autumn ignored her, her attention focused on her breakfast. But Mary couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness as she watched the ginger cat eat. She had grown so attached to Autumn and the kittens, so much so that the thought of them spending another winter outside was unbearable. Later that day, Mary made a decision. After a trip to the local hardware store, she spent the afternoon in the backyard with a hammer, nails, and a large wooden crate. The air was cold and sharp, but Mary worked steadily, her breath puffing in front of her as she pieced together what would soon become a cozy shelter for the little family. She lined the inside with insulation and layered it with blankets, making sure there was enough space for Autumn and all 4 kittens to snuggle together comfortably. There, she said proudly as she stepped back to admire her work. It's not much, but it'll keep you warm. She carried the shelter onto the porch and set it in the corner, away from the wind. When she looked up, she saw Autumn sitting at the edge of the garden, watching her with those unblinking green eyes. This is for you, Mary called softly, patting the top of the shelter. You and your little ones. Autumn didn't move, but there was something in the way she watched Mary that made her heart ache. A quiet kind of understanding, like the cat knew how much she cared. Eventually, Autumn stood and padded toward the shelter. She sniffed the edges, testing it carefully, before stepping inside and curling up in the blankets. Mary smiled, her chest swelling with relief. Good, she whispered. That's good. The cold weather brought changes to the little family. The kittens had grown bigger now, their once wobbly steps replaced with confident bounds as they raced around the yard, chasing leaves and each other with reckless abandon. Scout remained the ringleader, always the first to dart out into the frost-covered grass, with Whiskers, Misty, and Rascal close behind. Autumn, meanwhile, had become more of a constant presence inside the house. At first, she would only wander through the door to eat or check on the kittens, her green eyes always sharp and watchful. But gradually, she began to linger. She would curl up on the old rug in the living room or sit beside Mary's chair, her tail flicking lazily as she watched the flames crackle in the fireplace. It was a slow, quiet transformation, but Mary noticed it all the same. One evening, as Mary sat in her chair knitting a blanket, she glanced up to find Autumn perched on the windowsill, staring out into the darkened yard. The orange glow of the fire illuminated her fur, giving her an almost golden hue. For a moment, Mary paused, watching the cat with a fond smile. "You don't have to keep watch anymore, you know," she said softly. "You're safe here. They're safe here." Autumn didn't move, but her ears twitched slightly, as though she'd heard Mary's words. After a moment, she stretched her body out and hopped down from the windowsill, making her way over to Mary's chair. She paused at Mary's feet, looking up at her with those knowing green eyes before leaping gracefully into her lap. Mary blinked in surprise, her hands stilling mid-stitch. "Well now," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "That's a first." Autumn curled up in her lap, her body warm and solid, and began to purr, a deep, steady sound that seemed to fill the room with peace. Mary let out a soft laugh, tears gathering in her eyes as she rested her hand on the cat's back. "I suppose we're family now, aren't we?" she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "You and me. All of us." Autumn's purr grew louder, as though she agreed. Christmas came quietly that year, the house aglow with warmth and life. Mary had decorated the living room with strings of twinkling lights and an old wreath she'd dusted off from storage. A small tree sat in the corner, its branches adorned with simple ornaments that reflected the soft glow of the fire. The kittens, of course, were delighted by the new additions. Scout immediately climbed halfway up the tree, his tiny claws hooking into the branches before Mary caught him and gently placed him back on the ground. Whiskers batted at the ornaments with wide-eyed wonder, while Rascal tried and failed to pounce on the lights that dangled along the floor. Misty, as always, was content to sit quietly beside Mary, watching the chaos with her soft amber eyes. Autumn had claimed her usual spot near the fireplace, curled into a neat ball with her tail tucked around her nose. As Mary sat in her chair, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands, she watched the kittens play and felt something deep in her chest, a fullness she hadn't known in years. For so long, the house had felt empty, its rooms filled with silence and memories she couldn't escape. But now it was alive. The sounds of purring, soft paws patting across the floor, and Mary's own laughter echoed through the halls, replacing the loneliness with something she could only describe as joy. "This is the best Christmas I've had in years," she said softly, though she wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. Scout paused mid-pounce, blinking up at her as though he understood. Mary smiled, reaching down to scratch his ears. "You're all miracles, you know that? Every single one of you." She looked toward Autumn, who lifted her head slightly, her green eyes meeting Mary's. "Especially you," Mary whispered. "You brought them to me. You saved me." Autumn blinked slowly, the firelight reflecting in her gaze, and Mary knew, just as she had known from the very first day, that the cat understood. That night, as Mary climbed into bed, she heard the soft patter of paws on the hardwood floor. A moment later, the kittens appeared, scrambling onto the bed one by one. Scout curled up near her feet, while Whiskers and Misty nestled together beside her pillow. Rascal, true to form, climbed onto her chest and flopped down with a contented sigh. Mary laughed softly, stroking the little kitten's back. "You're lucky I don't need much room, Rascal," she murmured. She glanced toward the door and saw Autumn sitting just outside, her silhouette framed in the soft glow of the hallway light. The ginger cat hesitated for only a moment before leaping gracefully onto the bed. She curled up at Mary's side, pressing her warm body close, her purring filling the quiet room. Mary closed her eyes, a peaceful smile on her lips. The house that had once been so empty was now filled with life. And for the first time in years, Mary didn't feel alone. "Good night, my little miracles," she whispered, her voice soft as a breath. "Thank you for finding me." The kittens purred softly in response, their tiny bodies warm and still. And as Mary drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of a ginger cat leading her through a quiet forest, the sound of tiny paws following close behind. The months that followed settled into a gentle rhythm. Winter passed quietly, and spring arrived with its soft breezes and blooming flowers, painting the garden in hues of yellow and pink. The kittens grew bigger, stronger, and bolder with every day, their personalities shining brighter as they tumbled through the grass and chased butterflies under the warm sun. Scout, the brave leader, had claimed a special spot as Mary's shadow. Whether she was in the kitchen preparing tea or outside tending to the garden, Scout was always close by, watching her with those sharp, curious eyes as if ready to follow her anywhere. Whiskers, true to his playful nature, had taken a liking to Mary's knitting yarn. On more than one occasion, she had come back to the living room to find a tangled mess of strings stretching across the floor, with Whiskers sitting proudly in the middle of it all, batting a loose strand as though it were a prize. Misty remained the quiet observer, always content to curl up in Mary's lap or on the windowsill, watching the world go by with calm, amber eyes. Mary often found herself whispering secrets to Misty, as though the little kitten understood her better than anyone else. And Rascal, sweet, mischievous Rascal, continued to live up to his name. He climbed everything, knocked over anything, and managed to squeeze himself into the most unlikely places. One afternoon, Mary discovered him napping in the flower bed, his gray fur dusted with dirt and his nose tucked beneath a daffodil. She had laughed so hard that tears rolled down her cheeks. "You're going to be the death of me, Rascal," she'd said, scooping him up and brushing the dirt from his fur. But her smile had been wide and warm, her heart light. Autumn, meanwhile, had become more than just a visitor. She had become part of the house, a permanent, steady presence that Mary couldn't imagine living without. The ginger cat had claimed her own corner of the living room, a soft cushion near the fire where she would curl up to nap while the kittens played nearby. She still ventured outside often, disappearing into the garden for hours at a time, but she always returned. Mary suspected she liked to wander out of habit, the same instinct that had kept her alive during her years as a stray. But now, when Autumn returned, it wasn't out of desperation or loneliness. It was because this was her home, their home. "You chose us, didn't you?" Mary said one evening as she sat beside the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. Autumn was curled at her feet, her green eyes half closed in contentment. "Out of all the houses, out of all the people, you chose me." Autumn didn't move, but her tail flicked gently, as though agreeing. Mary smiled, her chest swelling with gratitude. "I needed you too," she whispered. One evening in early summer, Mary sat on the porch watching the sun set, the sky painted in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The kittens were playing in the yard, their tails swishing like little flags as they pounced on dandelions and chased each other through the grass. Scout had grown taller now, his once tiny frame turning sleek and strong. Whiskers still carried his playful energy, tumbling headfirst into the garden without a care in the world. Misty, ever the quiet one, perched on the edge of the porch beside Mary, her amber eyes reflecting the light of the setting sun. And Rascal, well, Rascal was currently attempting to climb the wooden railing, his back legs dangling comically as he scrambled to pull himself up. Mary laughed, shaking her head as she watched him. "You'll never change, will you?" she called, and Rascal mewed loudly in reply, his voice indignant. As the sun dipped lower, Autumn appeared from the garden, stepping quietly onto the porch. She sat beside Mary, her tail wrapping neatly around her paws, and together they watched the kittens play. Mary sighed softly, the weight in her chest a familiar one, grateful, full, but tinged with something she couldn't quite name. "I don't know how you found me," she said quietly, looking down at Autumn, or why you chose me. But you saved me. Autumn turned her head slightly, her green eyes meeting Mary's, and for a moment, it felt as though the cat understood. You brought them here, Mary continued, her voice soft, and you brought me back to life. As the seasons passed, the little house at the edge of town became a place of quiet happiness. The kittens grew into strong, healthy cats, each with their own personality and charm. Scout, the bold leader, often ventured into the garden to patrol, always returning to check on Mary before settling at her feet. Whiskers, forever playful, found endless entertainment in everything from fallen leaves to shoelaces. Misty, the quiet companion, rarely left Mary's side, while Rascal, sweet, mischievous Rascal, remained the eternal troublemaker, stealing Mary's knitting yarn and hiding it in impossible places. Autumn stayed, too. She had claimed the house and the family it held as her own, watching over her kittens and Mary, with the same quiet strength that had carried her through those lonely years as a stray. Mary often thought back to the day Autumn had first appeared, a shadow at the edge of the garden. It felt like a lifetime ago now, and yet it was as vivid as yesterday. One morning, as Mary sat in her chair with a cup of tea, Misty curled on her lap, and Scout dozing at her feet, she looked out toward the garden and smiled. The house was no longer empty. It was filled with life, purring, playing, and the soft, comforting presence of a family she hadn't known she'd been missing. A knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts, and she set down her tea to answer it. It was her neighbor, Mr. Dawson, a kind man who often stopped by to chat. He held a small basket of tomatoes from his garden, a warm smile on his face. "Morning, Mary," he said, handing her the basket. "Thought you might like some fresh tomatoes." "Thank you," Mary replied, her smile bright. As Mr. Dawson glanced over her shoulder, he caught sight of Autumn stretched out on the rug near the fire, with Rascal sprawled across her back, fast asleep. The kittens were playing nearby, their little paws batting at a ball of yarn. "You know," Mr. Dawson said with a chuckle, "I think you've got more company now than anyone else in this neighborhood." Mary laughed softly, glancing back at the cozy scene. "I wouldn't have it any other way." "You've done a good thing, Mary," he said, his voice warm. "They're lucky to have you." Mary's eyes softened as she looked back at Autumn, the cat lifting her head just enough to meet her gaze. "I think," she said quietly, "I'm the lucky one." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house settled into its quiet rhythm, Mary sat on the porch with Autumn by her side. The kittens, now grown, explored the yard, their playful shadows darting across the grass. The air was warm, carrying the scent of summer blooms and the hum of distant crickets. Mary closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her home, the soft purr of Autumn at her feet, the distant mews of her cats, the whisper of wind through the trees. "This is enough," she whispered to herself, her voice soft. "This is everything." Autumn purred in response, her presence solid and steady, and Mary smiled. As the sky turned dark and the stars began to appear, Mary leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of her loneliness lifted completely. The stray cat had brought more than just kittens to her doorstep. It had brought love, laughter, and a sense of family she had thought was lost forever. And as Mary sat there in the quiet, she knew that some miracles came in the smallest, most unexpected forms. Wrapped in soft fur and steady purrs, delivered not by chance, but by a bond too deep for words. And it was a bond that would last forever.